It's great to be back in Arkansas. I actually started my early journalism career, such as it was, in the likes of Arkansas. So I grew up in the schizophrenic town of Texarkana. So anyway, that probably explains it all right there anyway. But it's great to be with you. You know, it all started for me, my journey all started for me when I saw the movie Mississippi Burning. And there was a press premiere, actually, that I attended, and with obviously a lot of other press guys. But two of the people who were there were actually, you know, the movie's fictional, you know that, don't you? I mean, it's all made up mostly. But it's based on, you know, things that really happened, the killings of the 3 civil rights workers, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney. So I saw the movie, and it's a very powerful film. And after the movie was over with, of course, all the other press people, you know, left immediately, hit the door. But I was very struck. I stood around, and there was kind of this gathering of old men. There's 2 FBI agents who investigated that case, as well as a journalist who covered that case and many others, a guy by the name of Bill Miner, who's still around. Bill's still doing what he always did, which I love him to death. But they began to explain what really happened to me. And that was the beginning of my journey. They began to explain, you know, okay, well, this is not what happened as portrayed in the movie. Here's what really happened. And began to explain, okay, here's why the state of Mississippi, you know, we went to the state of Mississippi, but they wouldn't prosecute the case, all these kind of things. But the thing that horrified me, I think most of all, is the fact that there were more than 20 guys involved in the killing of those 3 kids, and nobody had ever been prosecuted for murder. It just horrified me. About a month later, I don't know if you're like me, but if somebody tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. Are y'all like that? By the way, I have to tell you, I'm very grateful to be able to say y'all. I speak around the country, and it's very uncomfortable when I have to, you know, I'm not able to say y'all as much. Anyway, there was this agency that existed in Mississippi, which just finding out this agency existed was horrifying enough to me, but it was called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. It was, by the way, Arkansas had one too. Did y'all know that? In fact, they actually went to Mississippi, checked to see how it was set up, and came back and set up their own, just copied what Mississippi was doing. But anyway, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, if you don't know anything about it, was basically kind of the state's equivalent of a white citizens council. It was set up in 1956. It was headed by the governor. I mean, this wasn't some agency they stuck back in some little closet. This was headed by the governor. And it basically had 2 arms, 2 main arms. One was kind of the public relations, or if you might want to call it propaganda kind of arm. And basically what they did is they sent speakers up north, both white and black, although interestingly they paid the black speakers to go up north. And they would go up north and they would say, oh, we love segregation. We love how things are in Mississippi, you know, and, you know, other lies. Anyway, and so that was that arm, the propaganda arm. And then the other arm was the spy arm. And basically they infiltrated civil rights groups, spied on people, smeared people, got people actually had people run out of the state, fired from their jobs, lots of horrible things. Well, you know, again, this is all news to me. I didn't know any of this. Come to find out, this agency existed, and the Mississippi legislature sealed all the records till, like in 1977, they didn't just seal the records for a few years. They sealed them until 2027. So me being a cynical journalist, there's like 132,000 records. I'm thinking, there's something in there. And so I began to develop sources who had access to some of the files. And they began to leak me those files. And what they showed was at the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. Beckwith for the killing of Medgar Evers. This other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting the defense trying to get Beckwith acquitted. And nobody knew that. My story ran on October 1st, 1989. At the time that my story ran, the odds were literally more than 1,000,000 to 1 against the case ever being reopened. But Merle Evers, who's the widow of Medgar Evers, believed, and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A couple of months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet, happened to find a box of photographs, including the fingerprint of Byron D. Beckwith lifted from the murder weapon. A couple of months after that, Merle Evers shared with me her copy of the court transcript that she had saved. And a couple of months after that, the prosecutor in the case found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet. Sounds like I'm making this up, I know. It all really happened. In fact, when I went to grad school, I remember one time all these journalism students that I was talking to and teaching and stuff, and I'm like, okay, who all wants to write a novel? Half of them raise their hand. I'm like, why? You can't make this stuff up, right? So, anyway, my story ran, the case got reopened, I told you about all that. They made a movie about this. Now, some of you may have seen it. It's called Ghosts of Mississippi. It came out some years ago, I think 96 when the movie came out, which is about the reopening of the case. And I'm portrayed as a character in the film, which is an interesting, I have to tell you, I don't even want to get into a whole lot of detail about that. I'll go into some detail about it. But the question I usually get from people, I actually get two questions usually. First question is, were you portrayed accurately? And the second question I get is, did you get a lot of money? And the two quick answers are no and no. There's nothing that my character says in the movie that I actually said in real life, and I didn't get any money. But my wife and I were fortunate enough to get invited to the premiere of the film up in New York City. It was the first time I'd ever been in New York, and I was a gawking tourist, looking up at the tall buildings and everything. And so we go to the premiere of the film in Manhattan, and we're there, and all these celebrities are there. Whoopi Goldberg is there, and Rob Reiner is there, and Alec Baldwin is there, before he hit the guy. And so we're all there, and so my wife's like, okay, there are all these celebrities around. We can't talk. So if there's anything inaccurate in the movie, just press my palm. I'm like, okay. So the house lights go off, the movie screen goes dark, movie starts. This story is true. And I'm like, another question I usually get about the movie, people who've seen it, James Woods plays Byron D. Beckwith in the film, and so people ask me, was Beckwith really that racist? I'm like, Beckwith was more racist than they actually could portray him in the film. He was so racist they couldn't even portray him at that racist in the film. But I went to interview Byron D. Beckwith. Actually, in order to go interview Byron D. Beckwith, you have to pass the quiz. And so that's him calling now. Anyway, but you had to pass the quiz. And the quiz goes like this. Are you white? Where did you grow up? What are your parents' names? Where do you go to church? Where do you live? It keeps going on after that, but that gives you a pretty good flavor for it. So, I could have refused to answer the questions, but I'm about as waspish. My upbringing was extremely conservative, Christian, waspish. I couldn't have, couldn't have been a better quiz for me, right? So I passed with flying colors. And so I went up to see him. I went to interview him. This is in April of 1990. I went up to interview him in person. And He lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, which is just outside of Chattanooga, if y'all know where that is. And so we spent, I don't know, about 5 or 6 hours talking. And Signal Mountain's a beautiful place when it's, when it's getting dark, but not if you happen to be standing next to Byron Beckwith. So he insisted on like walking me out to the car. My car's like at the end of the driveway, I'm like, really? That's okay. I think I can find my way. So he walks me out to the car anyway. He gets me out there and says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. So his wife had made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with the sandwich. Beckwith fought extradition from Tennessee to Mississippi, and so it actually was literally more than a year that he fought that. And so he's back in Mississippi. He's bringing him back to Mississippi in handcuffs, and he's in the courtroom, and guess who he spots? Me, yeah. So he sees me across the courtroom and says, you see that boy over there? When he dies, he's going to Africa. So I turned to my friend Ed and went, I've always wanted to go to Africa. Not surprisingly, Byron Beckwith was convicted in that case. In fact, he was convicted February 5th, 1994, almost 30 years to the exact day of when he had been tried in the exact same courtroom. Amazing. The next case I got involved a guy by the name of Vernon Dahmer. And some of you probably know who Vernon Dahmer is. I'm guessing most of you may not have even heard the name. But Vernon Dahmer lived in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is about an hour and a half south of Jackson. He was a businessman. He was a farmer, NAACP leader. He had dedicated his life to voting rights in his country. The Klan didn't like that, and they literally attacked him and his family in the middle of the night. January 10th, 1966. They Klansmen firebombed his house in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning. Began firing their guns into the house. He woke up, grabbed a shotgun, ran to the front of the house, began firing back at the Klansmen so that his family could escape safely out a back window. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs, and he died later that day. A few weeks later, in the mail came his voter registration card. He had fought his whole life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote, but he'd never been able to cast a ballot himself. The guy who ordered Vernon Dahmer's killing was a guy by the name of Sam Bowers. Sam Bowers was the head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi, which was the most violent Klan organization in the United States, responsible for at least 10 killings that we know of. Bowers had never been convicted in that case. The Vernon Dahmer family approached me shortly after Beckwith was indicted. He got indicted in late 1990, and a few months after that, the Dahmer family came to me and asked me if I'd be interested in writing about that case, and of course I said yes. And shortly after that, they met with the district attorney. He acted initially interested. Yeah, I'm going to do something, and then time went on, and he got less and less interested. And so it looked like nothing was going to happen. And then this district attorney left office, another district attorney came in. This is now 96. It looks like nothing's going to happen, at least at this point. So I ended up accepting a fellowship to go to Ohio State and get my master's. So I did that. So I'm literally in Ohio in spring of 1997 when I got a phone call. The guy would not give me his name, but he said he had information about the Vernon Dahmer case and wanted to meet with me. So I flew back to Mississippi, met with him on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It was me and him and a couple of sons of Vernon Dahmer. I think everybody had guns except me. But anyway, I had my pen though, you know. So the guy's name was Bob Stringer, turns out. Well, Bob Stringer, turns out, had worked for Sam Bowers. He was like an errand boy for Sam Bowers. In fact, the other thing is he actually used to type the Klan propaganda that got put out because, well, I guess he was the only one in the Klan that knew how to type. Anyway, so Bob came forward and he said he had overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Dahmer. Shortly after he met with me and the Dahmer family, he met with the authorities, and the authorities reopened the case. The guy, so the state reopens the case in earnest now. They're actually serious about it finally. The guy who had been the key witness back in the 1960s, they did have some trials, but unfortunately it's kind of a joke. The people who did get convicted, the governor either commuted the sentence, pardoned them, you know, gave them work release or whatever, you know, it was kind of a joke. So I was researching about that, and one of the guys that was convicted and had turned state's evidence and testified against these other guys that were involved, he had dropped his gun at the scene, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, and was sentenced to life. But his name was Billy Roy Pitts. He was involved in the killing, had testified against the other guys. Well, I was doing research on how much time all these guys did, and what the authorities, the reason I hadn't been able to find a record, this is what the local authorities told me, was because Pitts had gone into the federal witness protection program. He had done federal time, he did 4 years in federal time, and the reason there's no record of state time is because he went into the witness protection program. So I'm talking to someone from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I'm like, okay, now understand, as soon as he got done with his federal time, he went to the witness protection program, and the woman said, that's impossible. I'm like, what are you talking about? She said, the federal witness protection program didn't exist at that time. So you follow me? So Billy Roy Pitts didn't serve 1 day of his life sentence. So I reported that. Actually called him first. In fact, no one knew where he was, and this will sound like an advertisement for an internet site. I got on switchboard.com, which you don't have to type in the city or the state. All you got to do is put in the name, and so I punched it in, and up it popped. Billy Roy Pitts. His address, Denham Springs, Louisiana. It had his telephone number. So the first 20 minutes of the conversation went like this. How'd you find me? How'd you find me? Like, it's on the internet. The internet, I got an enlisted telephone number. I'm like, well, I guess you have to take it up with them. So as a result of my story, the Mississippi authorities issued a warrant for Billy Pitts' arrest. He didn't care for that. In fact, he ran. And while he was on the run, he sent me a cassette tape he recorded. And so I got it in the mail, I put it in my cassette player, and this is literally how it began. Jerry, I just thought I'd let you know you've ruined my life. But I promised if I talked to anybody, I'd talk to you. So here's this tape. On the tape, he proceeds to tell me all about his involvement in killing Vernon Dahmer, all about his involvement in all this other Klan violence. This now, so shortly after that, he turns himself in. And this now leads to the arrest of Sam Bowers and his right-hand guy, whose name was Devers Nix. Now, when the family brought Devers Nix in, it was the most pitiful sight you have ever seen in your life. You know, they like wheeled him in the wheelchair. You had like the tall green oxygen tank, you know, he's breathing out of. So the family wheels him up in front of the judge, and he's like, I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, Judge. Judge is like, well, I normally don't do this, but I'm going to let you out without bond. A dozen days later, this is like a reporter's dream. We catch him on the golf course. So we got pictures. So we ran like before and after pictures, you know. Him in the wheelchair, breathing oxygen, him playing golf. So he got arrested. Yeah, he loved me. So fast forward now, Sam Bowers goes on trial in August of 1998. And guess who's there to testify on his behalf but Devers Nix, and wearing the same golf cap, which just cracked me up to no end. But Devers Nix was represented by this really good criminal defense lawyer, but by now he's in his 80s, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay, but the reason I'm telling you that will be apparent in a minute. So his lawyer's explaining to him about his Fifth Amendment rights. And I know y'all already know this. You watch their cop shows and everything else that explain all this. But you obviously can claim your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination at any point, even if you're on the witness stand. So he's working out a signaling system, you know, with them. And so his lawyer's like, now, Devers, when you get up there, if you need to take the Fifth, I'm going to raise my hand. Devers like, okay. So Devers gets on the witness stand. I looked over about 5 minutes later, his lawyer, y'all can probably guess this part. So much for the signaling. So, you know, he keeps testifying, right? So he's like, yeah, I was in the Klan. Or he like tries to put a positive spin on that, like there is one, you know. Why, the Klan was a benevolent organization, passing out fruit baskets to the needy at Christmas. So under cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him, Mr. Nix, just how many fruit baskets did you pass out? And Devers says, oh, sad to say, none. I swear it was the funniest trial I ever covered in my life. Deadly serious matter, but funny trial. Sam Bowers was represented by a guy by the name of Travis Buckley. And if you want to get a kind of a mental image of what Buckley looks like, have you seen the Budweiser commercial with the iguana? That's Buckley. Anyway, he's got like iguana eyes, and Buckley was not only was he the lawyer for the Klan back in the 1960s in Mississippi, but he was in the Klan. You know, he was a member of the Klan. So he's cross-examining Billy Roy Pitts about this planning meeting. There's a planning meeting that took place prior to the raid on Vernon Dahmer and his family. So Buckley's asking him about this. Now, Mr. Pitts, who all was at that planning meeting? You know, Pitts is like, well, let's see. I was there. Sam Bowers was there. Devers Nix was there. Well, you were there. And Buckley's like, objection, Your Honor. You know, I've covered a lot of trials in my life, but that's the only trial I ever covered where a witness implicated the defense lawyer in the case. Not surprisingly, Sam Bowers was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, just like Beckwith. In fact, their cells were just one cell apart in the prison just outside Jackson. The case that I kind of got involved with quite accidentally was the Birmingham church bombing case, which she's already talked to you about, which is a horrific case in Birmingham's past. Bobby Cherry was one of the last living suspects in that case. And strangely enough, in spring of 1997, his wife contacted me and said, Bobby wants to talk to you. I'm like, okay. And so I drove over, and he lived near Tyler, Texas, which is not too far from, you know, my schizophrenic hometown. So anyway, so I just drove over to him and lived near Tyler, and I met him there and took him and his wife out for barbecue because, well, I guess that's what you take Klansmen out for. I'm not really sure, but anyway. So we went out and we had barbecue and we talked. He insisted on his innocence. He was like, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop. The sign shop, if you've ever been to Birmingham, is 2.5 blocks from where the church blew up. It's also where they made the bomb. So he's telling me all this. He's like, I didn't have anything. I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling. Can't make this stuff up, can you? Anyway, so he even pulled out the sworn statement from a woman and says, yes, I remember that night. Well, we're all sitting around watching wrestling. So I got back to the newspaper the next day, and there's kind of a rule, and this is the way we say it in the South in journalism. Even if your mama tells you she loves you, check it out. So I did. And asked our librarian, Susan Garcia, I said, Susan, just check with the Birmingham News and see what was on TV that night. Most of y'all are old enough to remember when they used to print them in a like really tiny box, and it was everything that was possibly on television on all 2 channels, right? Or 3. So the next day I got an email from Susan. There was no wrestling. In fact, there hadn't been wrestling on for years, it turns out. Which is so stupid, right? You're a criminal. You got your little criminal to-do list. It should be like 1, check alibi. So Bobby Cherry got arrested. And I had heard that he had something to do with the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. Now, y'all may or may not know who Fred Shuttlesworth was, but Fred Shuttlesworth may well have been one of the bravest guys in the civil rights movement. I mean, his church was bombed, his house was bombed, he was beaten. I mean, my favorite story about him is he had a concussion, he wound up in the hospital, and he told the doctor, the Lord knew I lived in a hard town, so he gave me a hard head. So I heard that Cherry had something to do with the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth when he showed up at the all-white Birmingham schools trying to enroll his daughters after Brown versus Board of Education. This was actually in '57, that Cherry had something to do with that beating. So one of the perks of my job, which is kind of cool, is I get free books in the mail once in a while, on the civil rights movement. So one day in the mail comes this big, thick biography of Fred Shuttlesworth. And I don't know about you, but the first thing I do when I get a big, thick book, look at the pictures. So I'm flipping through, I'm looking at the pictures, and there's a picture of the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. And so my mind's already going because I heard Bobby Cherry had something to do with this. It's kind of a distant shot, and I can't really make much out of it. So I called the author. I said, are there any other pictures of the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth? And he's like, there's footage of it. Like, you're kidding. He said, yeah, there's footage of it. And so he told me where to find it. It was an old CBS documentary called Who Speaks for Birmingham that they made. And so I tracked it down and got it. As it turns out, Bobby Cherry had kind of a semi-estranged son who was a truck driver. He used to come through Jackson once in a while. So I called him. I said, you mind coming by and just look at this footage? He's like, sure, no problem. So next time he was in Jackson, he came by and I showed him the footage. He goes, yep, there's Dad. And even pointed out something I didn't see. It's like, yeah, you see him reaching in his right front pocket? That's where he kept his brass knuckles. And sure enough, you can see him pull his brass knuckles out and just waylay Fred Shuttlesworth. I'm sure that's how he got the concussion. So So Bobby Cherry went on trial in 2002 in Birmingham, and they showed that footage of him beating Fred Shuttlesworth and introduced the television logs that showed there was no wrestling on television. He was convicted and given 4 life sentences, 1 for each of those girls. The next case is the one that I've written the most about, which is the Mississippi burning case, the 3 civil rights workers I mentioned at the beginning. And in fact, I'll add right here is there are still 4 suspects still alive in that case, still walking around. And I'm still working on it. I've got 40,000 pages of FBI documents I've been going through. So, but remember what I told you before, if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. Well, Sam Bowers gave an interview, and Sam Bowers never gave interviews, and he gave an interview in which he kind of talked about his life, etc., to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, but it was sealed. Nobody could have access to it. The only time anybody was going to ever get access to it was after Bowers died, and Bowers was still alive, albeit in prison. So I managed to develop sources who leaked me that interview. And in that interview, Bowers talked about the '67 federal trial. There was a federal trial on federal conspiracy charges, and Bowers was one of 7 guys that got convicted. The rest of the 18 walked away. So Bowers was talking about this. This lets you know kind of how Bowers' kind of evil mind worked. Bowers was said about that trial, he was quite delighted to be convicted and have the main instigator of the entire affair walk out of the courtroom a free man. And he was referring to a guy by the name of Edgar Ray Killen, or as he's called locally, Preacher Killen. And I got news for you, Preacher Killen did not go to the seminary anyway. So I called Preacher Killen up. We talked for quite a while. Finally, at some point, he said, "There's some guy in Jackson just keeps stirring things up and stirring things up and stirring things up." And I just didn't have the heart to tell him it was me. So I took him and his wife out for catfish. We went out, we ate catfish, one of those $8.95 all-you-can-eat catfish places. I still like those places. I don't know about y'all anyway. This was a really good one too. It was like all the, the catfish is just a whole catfish, and you just scrape it off the bone. So anyway, he's an impressive eater, I might add. Anyway, he got his $8.95 worth. Actually, I paid for it. But anyway, so we talked, and I asked him if he had anything to do with the killing of those kids. He denied it. And then I asked him, well, what do you think should happen to people who were responsible for killing those kids? And he said, I'm not going to say they were wrong. And then he proceeded to tell this story about himself. After Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis in 1968, at that moment in time, the FBI did not know who did it and literally sent out FBI agents all over the country. 2 of them showed up at the doorstep of Preacher Killen, wanting to know his whereabouts on April 4th, 1968. Preacher Killen would not talk to him. But the FBI agent left his card. So time goes on. Some point, Preacher Killen picks up that card, calls the FBI agent, wants to know who killed King. FBI agent's like, why do you want to know? And Killen says, man, I want to shake his hand. Sometimes I have people, even people I know well, say to me, Jerry, why don't you leave these old guys alone? But the thing they don't realize or think about is these were young killers who just happened to get old. Edgar Ray Killen was convicted on the exact anniversary of the killings of these kids, June 21st, 2005. The most recent case involved a guy by the name of James Ford Seal. There were 2 kids, their names were Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Moore. They were both 19. They lived in rural Mississippi, rural southwest Mississippi, not too far from Natchez, if you know where that is. and they were hitchhiking. Pretty common in 1964, whether you were white or black. If you were poor, you didn't have a car and you were hitchhiking. And that's what they were doing. They were already in town. They were just trying to get back home. So guess who pulls up? But James Ford Seal, Klansman, pulls up in his Volkswagen Bug, pretends to be a government agent, and orders them to get in his car. So they do. What those kids didn't know was there was a whole carload of Klansmen in the vehicle behind them. They took those kids out to the Homachita National Forest. I mean, I'm talking about, you guys have places like this in Arkansas. I used to live in Arkansas. I mean, remote. Imagine the most remote place around here. That's what we're talking about, just a remote place where nobody can hear you scream. They took those kids out and they beat them and beat them and beat them. Loaded them into the trunk of a Ford, drove to the Mississippi River, duct taped their mouths, their wrists, their ankles, and one by one threw them into the river where they drowned. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone does something like that, don't they deserve to be punished? No matter how long it's been, 10 years, 20, 30, 40. James Ford Seal was convicted summer of 2007 and given 3 life sentences. And his conviction just got, the U.S. Supreme Court, I'll use the legal term, denied cert on it the other day. In other words, the appeals for the most part are basically over with. His was the 23rd conviction in these cases. Isn't that amazing? And it's a matter of faith with me, but I happen to believe God's hand has been involved in these cases. But the most amazing thing that I've witnessed has not been the convictions. It's been some of the racial reconciliation. Not too long after Sam Bowers was convicted, Billy Roy Pitts testified in a hearing. And when he was done, he walked to the back of the courtroom. And when he did, he ran into the Vernon Dahmer family. There was the widow, Mrs. Dahmer, a couple of the Dahmer children. And Billy Roy Pitts apologized to Mrs. Dahmer for killing her husband and asked her to forgive him. And she did. And she began to cry. He began to cry. And the Dahmer children who were there began to cry. And I began to cry. Isn't that what God does for us? Forgives us when we have no business being forgiven. Isn't that really what redemption's all about? Trying to make things right, even when they've gone so terribly wrong in the past. May God bless you in your journey in redemption. Thank you so much.
Wow. Okay. Got time for a few questions. Bob's right behind you.
It's ESPN 30 for 30 about Marcus Dupree.
Yeah, I saw some of that. Yeah.
In fact, they had the film, I guess you saw, the son of the chief deputy.
Yeah, Cecil Price. I saw the interview with Cecil Price Jr., yeah.
How did the integration of the schools, and especially the integration of the football teams, because it's like, one way you probably heard that football
helped to integrate. Yeah.
How did that help with the integration and the racial record?
I think it did. I think once the Southern all-white teams started losing in football, They were like, you know, they were all about, all of a sudden they were going, maybe we need to get integrated too. You know? There are some things that are bigger than school integration. That's football, right? You know, I can say that. I grew up in Texas, so anyway, it's a Friday night religion, right? Around here too, I know.
Dixon, we have a right behind you there.
Mr. Mitchell, thank you for being here, and I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your work. My name is Dixon McReynolds, and I'm a student here at the Clinton School.
Oh, great.
I have a two-part question.
Uh-oh.
One, why do you think Mr. Pitts sent you those tapes? Why? I know you said he wanted, you know, to talk to you only, but why do you really think he sent you those tapes prior to him being arrested? And two, why do these men want to just talk to you? Why do you think that they feel comfortable with talking to you?
Talking to me. I mean, what it boils down to, I mean, like the Pitts is unique in that sense. I mean, most of these Klan guys, you know, may initially talk to me, but they're not gonna admit their wrongs, like Killen, for example. So he was unique in that sense. The handful of Klansmen who've been like him in the sense of wanting to kind of bare their souls and kind of get right, you know, with their lives and make amends for some of the stuff they've done. Most of them not, though. With regard to why they talk to me, I can tell you why Beckwith, one of the reasons Beckwith talked to me is because I'm redheaded and I look like an albino. I don't know if you see my skin, but anyway, I'm serious. I mean, I'm telling you the truth. He thought I was like the purest of the pure of the white race. And yeah, I mean, and so he thought he'd found a kindred spirit of some sort. And you know, my background being what it was, he felt safe talking to me. And of course, I have to say, Beckwith couldn't keep his mouth shut. I mean, he was, you know, but he would only talk to certain people. And I think these other Klan guys talk to me. The reason they talk to me is, here's the great secret to journalism. It's everybody has a story they want to share, even Klansmen. And so people want to tell their story. And so that's, as a journalist, that's what you appeal to. You say, I'd like to hear your story. And I'm kind of the opposite of Mike Wallace, you know. And I've never understood that anyway. I mean, this idea of kind of running at people with microphones and, you know, having them, you know, run away and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, they look real guilty on TV, but it's not very good for your story. That's like if Bobby Cherry hadn't talked to me, I wouldn't have gotten any of that about the wrestling. So it's because he talked to me. I mean, if you're a journalist, you want people that you're interviewing, you want targets of your investigation to talk to you as much as humanly possible, because sometimes they'll tell you stuff that, you know, helps to convict them.
Yes, ma'am, right here.
Did you or your family ever feel that they were in danger?
Yes. And my dog, she sounds real vicious, but she'd probably lick somebody to death actually anyway. But you know, we've had threats, and been, you know, mainly directed at me, but we've had a few that are directed at the family more generally, and that's pretty disconcerting. The FBI did investigate those, and the one in particular, I found out the guy lived in South Carolina who had called, and I thought, well, at least he's got a ways to drive, you know.
Hey, Mark, got one right here. Wait a second, let me get you wait for the mic right here, buddy.
What is the number of potential cold cases that you think are still out there?
Well, in terms of numbers, I mean, the FBI has looked at over 100 cases now. I think they closed about half of those. But in terms of viability, their definition of how many are viable, I think they said about 10, or maybe as much as many as a dozen are viable. These cases are going to have to be pursued. If any of these cases are going to be prosecuted, they have to be done like now, or really close to now, because these guys are dying off, witnesses are dying off. It's getting more and more difficult to do these cases as years go on.
You talk about redemption. Have
Yep.
you experienced those same kinds of hatred currently?
Oh, do people still hate like that? Oh, goodness, yes, unfortunately. I mean, heck, I've had them say it just to me. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain group of people, and, that are no less racist than they were back then. I hate to tell you that. And then there's a whole nother generation behind them that's no less racist. So, I mean, I do think it's improving in this country, thankfully. I mean, like Mississippi is an example. And this doesn't necessarily reflect a change of heart. It reflects a change of law. But Mississippi in '64, hardly any African Americans could register to vote. And now there are more black elected officials than any other state. That's pretty good. I mean, that doesn't necessarily reflect a change in heart, but certainly reflects a change in the law, which I think has helped with that. Yeah, Margaret.
My name is Margaret Burnham, and I just wanted to, first of all, thank the Dean for having us here. We're from the Northeastern.
Yeah, the Northeastern, not to be confused.
Not to be confused with the wonderful Northwestern in Chicago. I know, there's this Mississippi
Exactly.
River, but they're, beyond that.
Exactly.
So we're from Northeastern in Boston, and we have a program there called the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Program, where our law students, I teach at the law school there, where our law students investigate many of these cases, and for prosecutors and also on the civil side. And so we've worked fairly closely with Jerry over the years on these cases. And I want to say how thrilled we are to be here at Little Rock and at the Clinton School of Public Service. And I have a question for Jerry, which is,
Margaret,
how do you keep yourself out of court? I know that, especially so,
Yeah.
for example, if the guy tells you, look, I was watching wrestling, at some
Yeah.
point, somebody's going to want to say, well, Jerry, come and tell us what the guy told you.
What the guy told you.
And then you've got, the question of, you got to try to keep yourself out. So how do you do that, Jerry?
I don't know. I guess I'm living right. Anyway, I actually came pretty close in the Seal case. They actually subpoenaed me, and we fought it. And to be honest, of course, I've covered courts for years, so I'm semi-familiar with the law. And I was thinking to myself, there is no way they're going to keep me off the witness stand, because I talked with Seal. I went and interviewed him, and in fact, I was the only one who got any kind of interview with him. And I went up and I kind of surprised him, to be honest. I just kind of showed up on his doorstep one day. And so I asked him if he had anything to do with, killing those kids, and he said, "I ain't in jail, am I?" That's a vote of confidence right there.
Hey, Jerry, what about the Emmett Till case?
Okay. Anyway, to finish it off, but the federal judge quashed the subpoena, so I was very fortunate in that case. The Emmett Till case got reinvestigated, and they reopened it in 2005, and then it was presented to a grand jury in the Delta in Mississippi, and they chose not to indict. And it was an African-American district attorney. The grand jury, I don't know exactly the grand jury racial makeup, but I know it's at least mixed, the racial makeup of that. So it was not like an all-white grand jury or something like that. And they weren't, the two main guys involved obviously were deceased. It was Carolyn Bryant, the woman that Emmett Till allegedly wolf whistled at, was still alive. So.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Over the years you've been doing your investigations, what
Yep.
can you share with us about your opinion, what you've learned about the credibility of the FBI?
Oh, gee. You're going to put me on the spot, aren't you? I mean, it has to do with the quality of the agent, to be honest with you. And there were some really good FBI agents back then. And unfortunately, there were some that were involved in stuff like COINTELPRO and some other things that were not so good. And so, Hoover's whole mentality anyway, he was trying to discredit King, get rid of King, even get King to commit suicide. I mean, so you got to have some serious questions about some of this stuff. So you kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis and weigh it. I will say this. I'm very grateful the FBI investigated a lot of these cases as much as they did. For instance, the Mississippi burning case, I think I mentioned before, I've got 40,000 pages to go through. But I'm grateful for that, because if they hadn't been so detailed on that, then it would make it a lot harder to, to find information about it.
Kate?
Hi. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the obvious reforms we need in our justice system if someone outside the system, a journalist, needs to do this important work.
In terms of how the system needs to be fixed, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Well, with regard to these cases, I think it's just a matter of, to be honest, I think the pursuit of these cases, there's not anything legal that keeps the pursuit of these cases from happening. I think it's more a matter of will. I mean, that's my opinion. What I have found is that the people, if you have a district attorney who really cares about pursuing these cases, if you have an investigator or an FBI agent or somebody who really cares about this, it's amazing what happens. It's when you get people that don't care about it that's really obvious, and they kind of drag their feet or make excuses, or they'd rather be doing anything else but work on the case, and they make it abundantly obvious, and you can find out pretty quickly about that. So I don't know that with regard to these cases there's necessarily reforms needed as much as the people just need the will to do it, and they need the support too, and I think that's where we as a people come in, be supportive of these prosecutions.
I guess I want to ask you about your legacy.
Oh no.
I really do want you, because it does seem to me that I couldn't go out if I were a reporter and do what you do. And so I'm really interested in your talking, particularly because there's so many young people here, about your legacy, because that's something that these young people are going to have to embrace and move forward.
To be honest with you, I mean, I don't think I'm some exceptional reporter. I mean, look, I don't think I'm a great writer. I don't think I'm a great reporter necessarily. Am I good at what I do? Yeah, I think I am. But I think that the lesson in it is persistence. And that's just be persistent. If there's a quality I have, I guess, it's that. Just be persistent. This happened to me in Arkansas, so this would be a fun story to share. I was working as a reporter in Hot Springs, and I was writing all these stories. There was kind of some corruption connected to the theme park, Magic Springs, and all this other stuff I was writing about. This was in the early 80s in Hot Springs. And the theme park was losing like $1 million a year, and there were these bonds that the city passed that were backing this, and all of a sudden Hot Springs was going to be out like $4.5 million, and the bond money wasn't spent for what it was supposed to be spent on, and I was reporting all this stuff. I was like writing a story a day on this. And finally some guy decided to sue. Well, the thing is, the validity of the bonds, that is. So the thing that was weird about it is most lawsuits, when people file them, they're trying to get money. He wasn't trying to get any money. He just wanted the bonds declared invalid. And so I was just kind of surprised by this. So I called him up and said, what made you decide to sue? He said, I got tired of reading about it in the paper.
All right, we've got time for one more question, and that question is going to go to Annie Abrams.
Thank you. All of us, when we enter into a career, and yours in the field of journalism, one or two things, I think. One is that we hope to be making this a better world, either in a preventive or in a remediation. And when you speak to audiences, whether it's a youth group, high school, white, or mixed, how do you engage with prevention that they won't be or they're stirring up?
Well, I mean, she was asking me about whether what I'm doing about prevention and to try to keep this from happening again. I hope that message is coming through. I try my best to make that message come through. I mean, that's the thing. We don't need to perpetuate this hate anymore. That's part of the problem with this country. And unfortunately, you can even see it springing up now. I mean, xenophobia right now is probably at an all-time high, and it's sad, you know, that people want to hate people who aren't like them, right? And that's still going on. And I think it's probably worse right now than it's been in a while. And so people want to define other people that they don't like as other, and that's what you see now. They invalidate those people. Or there's an excellent book written years ago by Sam Kean. If you haven't seen this, I highly recommend it. It's called Faces of the Enemy, and all it is a collection of World War II propaganda. It's the propaganda we had against the Japanese and the Germans. It's the German propaganda against us. It's the Japanese propaganda against us. And this is what happens. We try to dehumanize the enemy, right? And if you dehumanize the enemy, you can destroy them. You've got justification. They're not human. They're subhuman in some way. And so that's what you see going on now, unfortunately. If they're not doing it literally, they're doing it figuratively. And so I hope there's a lot of healing that needs to happen in this country, and I'm hopeful that we'll work toward that.